Welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue in our progress through the book of Philippians, with this being lesson number 5. Paul is now in this book into his main narrative and beginning to issue exhortations from his prison location concerning both issues that he wants them to address, as well as updates relative to some travel plans of Timothy and Epaphroditus, who's a Philippian that is traveling to see Paul. As we read between the lines, we can maybe glean a little bit about what Paul's status is, which is never really fully said. So let's read today's lesson, which will be chapter 2 of Philippians, verses 12 through 30. Reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Therefore, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed me, not only in my presence, but much more now in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, enabling you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without murmuring and arguing, so that you may be blameless and innocent children of God, without blemishes, in the midst of a crooked and perversive generation, in which you shine like stars in the world. It is by your holding fast to the word of life that I can boast on the day of Christ, that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. But even if I am being poured out as a libation over the sacrifice and the offering of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you, and in the same way you also must be glad and rejoice with me. I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I may be cheered by news of you. I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. All of them are seeking their own interest, not those of Jesus Christ. But Timothy's worth you know, how like a son with a father he has served with me in the work of the gospel. I hope therefore to see him as soon as I see how things go with me, and I trust in the Lord that I will also come soon. Still, I think it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and co-worker and fellow soldier, your messenger and minister to my needs, for he has been longing for all of you, and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. He was indeed so ill that he nearly died, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, so that I would not have one sorrow after another. I am the more eager to send him, therefore, in order that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. Welcome him then in the Lord with all joy, and honor such people, because he came close to death for the work of Christ, risking his life to make up for those services that you could not give me. Scholars report that the storyline here seems straightforward enough when we read it in our modern English translations. Some open their writings on these verses, however, with a warning to carefully maintain perspective, for without it, these can be troubling verses, especially verses 12 through 16. The perspective is that Paul knows he is not likely to be involved in the future of the church, as he will not survive imprisonment. Thus, they need to remain obedient to the gospel Paul taught them, and not some other version, even in his absence. Since Paul will not likely be there to guide them, they will have to adapt to future developments on their own. That is, as he refers to it here, work out their own salvation. A problem here is to whom the you in verse 12 is referring, scholars say. Most scholars teach clearly it is the church at Philippi, as noted in the addressee of the letter itself back there in verse 1. Paul was writing to that congregation, not to the individual Christian of that day or today, but to the congregation. So he is not saying here that the individual Christian is on his own. This is a corporate you, several scholars note. Dr. Charles Kosser remarks that we should remember in the preceding verses, what we studied last week and the week before, that Paul emphasized unity and harmony in the church with no focus on the individual in this letter. Dr. Morna Hooker of Cambridge teaches the appeal here is clearly concerning the Philippians, the plural yous, she says, not the individual. Yes, there is an understanding that individuals make up a group, but the exhortations are to the Philippians as a group, as a congregation. Concerning obedience, she notes in the Greek, Paul does not say to whom or what they have been obedient. Some translations, such as the New Revised Standard that we just read, assume it is Paul himself. That seems logical, since he follows it by indicating in his presence or absence. The key point is, however, that it is God to whom they are accountable for obedience, not Paul. Paul simply here is God's agent here through Jesus Christ. It is God's guidance they need to be obedient to in the future as well as now. Scholars suggest the blameless here is a reference to most likely the Old Testament Israelite purity laws, including separation from outsiders, and concerning the murmuring and arguing the Israelites did when Moses presented God's message to them. Dr. Charles Thompson of Abilene Christian University says, Paul is here evoking a tie between those Old Testament people of God and the church as a people of God. Exodus and Numbers reflect that they argued with God's plan and thus were not obedient to God. Others suggest Paul is making a backdoor reminder to the Philippians about their eternal strife, failure to unite properly, which we will learn about later in the book of Philippians. Other scholars suggest Paul is also placing emphasis here on the individual living out what salvation means. The Greek word used here for blameless is the same used in the Septuagint versions which is the Greek versions of the Old Testament and the Apocryphal writings, when addressing the obedience to the commandments. The church is now the children of God and must remain blameless by separating themselves from others and remaining obedient to the commandments of God, and consequently they will be blameless if they do so throughout their generations. Dr. Charles Kosser taught this word salvation that's used here is key, but it's loaded, as he says, with an exclamation mark. He suggests Paul is not in any way referring to the issue of grace versus works qualification for salvation here. Others add, no, he is referring to the Philippians and Paul having been partners in the ministry, and with Paul gone, he will not be there to guide them. They will then just be forced to be on their own and need to carefully find God's will in all that they do as they adapt to the absence of and loss of their leader, the Apostle Paul. Some scholars also note that this verse 17 is a symbolic reference to the Jewish sacrifice, where Paul there is referring to himself more or less as being sacrificed. That in that ritual sacrifice, both in Judaism and in the pagan faith, this libation is the pouring during the burning of the sacrifice. There is a point in which they force the flames and smoke to go up quickly by pouring something on it, and Paul is implying he is being poured out and as a sacrifice on that offering of faith. As we shift our focus to verses 19 through 30, scholars call this a hopeful travelogue in some ways. This is the only letter or place in the New Testament where this individual Epaphroditus is addressed. So there is little to learn about him from what we have here. It appears he to have been an emissary, first of all, from the Philippian congregation to Paul in prison. Understand that a person in prison in this period of time, to have any care for them, including their food, in many cases, it required friends and relatives to look after them. So the Philippians have apparently provided a person, and maybe other churches did too. Paul now seems to be high on him, though, and is giving him a high letter of recommendation here as he sends him back. So he maybe is returning as also now an emissary or reciprocal emissary. He's now an emissary of Paul and Christ. The nature of this illness that this man has is not made known here, but several scholars suggest Paul is hinting it is somehow related to his ministry. Others say he is nothing more than a Philippian Christian sent by the congregation to take prison gifts and to help care for Paul, who happened to have gotten sick in some form or fashion and is now being sent back home with this letter. Not many scholars support that idea, but there are some who strongly argue that. When it comes to Timothy, scholars say note that the word hope precedes there in verse 19, as it is significant. Timothy seems to have been Paul's most constant companion throughout his ministry, and Paul wants to send him to them soon, but not immediately, not until he sees how things go for Paul. So Paul is holding Timothy until then, as he seems to be the only one Paul has available that he, at this point, that he can trust to carry out the mission and not his personal mission. Timothy, it seems, is in a way here the heir apparent to Paul's ministry if Paul doesn't survive. Scholars like to speculate that those other Christian agendas, what those other Christian agendas might have been, but there's no direction as to what that might have been here, except for the fact that they're not putting other people's interest forward. Apparently, it's self-centered interest. Several scholars note that based on verse 22 and 23, Paul's final trial has not yet happened. Therefore, Paul has more than hope, but confidence or trust in the Lord, meaning Jesus Christ, that he will be released and he will come with Timothy to see them. Dr. Charles Thompson at Abilene Christian University who's probably the more theologian of the scholars I'm using, teaches that this reading has significant theological issues associated with it as well. Paul covers things like in his travel details, he is providing theological insight for his audience. For example, by sending these people, Paul recognizes the church is not finished when founded, but requires regular ministering to continue on its right track. Also, though, through the compliments of these men, he is implying that to follow Jesus means one must forsake a lot and sacrifice with a slavery-like devotion to imitate the life of Christ, that the life of Jesus is Christ that lived on earth, as a model of the one to honor and follow, rather than what society around them emphasized, which was self. In other words, Christ followed and was obedient to God's will, even when self was sacrificed in the process. All the scholars I use remark that we must keep perspective as we study this book of Philippians, and especially this reading here today. Paul is putting things together relative to whether he is present or absent, which he opened with originally in back there in verse 27 of chapter 1, which is basically where his narrative opens. So Paul is calling for obedience here to God's will and plan, just as Paul has done. The fear and trembling is an Old Testament reference to Moses' farewell. So there's to the Israelites. So there's a lot of symbolism here, scholars say, between Moses' farewell to the people and Paul's likely farewell to the Philippians. God is at work in you, Paul tells them. Respect that. The grace comes from him, comes from God. It didn't come from Paul. You are to work towards the end game, not as if your salvation reward is won at the start. Consequently, there should be respectful fear and trembling to find the will of God and to do the best you can under each circumstance. Paul's theology clearly was not one saved, always saved, once saved, always saved, but a careful effort to obey God's will to the end in every step of the way. So you are awarded God's grace and salvation at the end. Yes, these are confusing words when Paul says you must work out your salvation, this theologian says, but especially when he insistently teaches everywhere else that salvation is not works, but as the scholars is not gained based on works, but scholars pointed out very carefully, we have to separate those two ideas, because he's not talking about you gaining your salvation that way. Some scholars teach here that Paul is going back to his basic Pharisaical piety rules for which he came into Christianity. Paul still sees in Christianity the requirement to be obedient to God's will, and it's to that point. To meet that point requires humility. Paul frequently teaches that as an apostle, his preaching is done in meekness, weakness, fear, and trembling, in obedience to God's will. It is that obedience to God's will and faith that Paul now sees the gospel of Christ as God's plan for humans. It's that drives the ethics and ministry of Paul. He weaves that into this Pharisaical background that this man has, and he came into Christianity from. And we'll get a little better understanding of that as we develop it, as Paul lays it out there in his background next week in next week's class. So I hope you have a good Bible study, and I hope this gives you some insight as at least to how the scholars interpret these verses we read here today.